Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Humans Not Resources, the podcast presented by Klaar. And for those who are joining us for the first time, this podcast is all about performance management and talent management, and essentially how they are evolving. And I'm your host, Sharthok. I'm also one of the co-founders of Klaar, which is a performance management and talent management platform. So in these podcasts, you will find a lot of HR leaders, business leaders on how they view performance management, how to get the buy-ins from companies. We discuss about the best fit processes, the role of AI in performance management, talent management, DEI, and so much more. In short, it equips you with everything that you need to master the art of performance management. So without too much delay, let's jump right into today's episode. Awesome. I think we are live, Alex. And folks, welcome to another episode of Humans Not Resources, which is the podcast sponsored and powered by Klaar. And today I have with me someone who's very special, Alex Seiler. Alex, welcome to Humans Not Resources.
Thank you. Thanks for the warm welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And the folks who are, watching this episode, let me quickly introduce Alex. Now, I say quickly, Alex's experience spans, a lot of years, a lot of leadership roles, HR leadership roles. So Alex has 15 plus years of global experience in the people HR space, spent time working across different industries for companies like Citi, NBC Universal, WeWork, amongst others. And if you go to his LinkedIn, you'll find many, many more. His expertise is centered around, creating, transforming, and building out systems that really foster an equitable, innovative, and inclusive workplace culture. He has been a full-time Chief People Officer and Head of HR for GHG Control Risks and is currently focused on fractional clients. And that's what really, when I was looking at Alex's LinkedIn and when I got in touch with Alex quite some time back, that's what really drew me, his fractional work experience, because I think he's making a tremendous impact working in that capacity across multiple, companies. And he's also a startup advisor in the HR tech space, including yours truly for Klaar as well. Yeah, Alex, again, welcome to Humans Not Resources. So happy to have you here.
Really happy to be here, and especially at the beginning of our relationship and journey working together. So it's really exciting.
Let me dive right into the first question, which is my favorite question. That, Alex, over your 15, 20 years, so many companies, so many leadership roles, and now as a fractional exec, you would have seen multiple performance platforms. And Klaar is certainly not the first one you would have come across. But with so many platforms, and they're all good in their own ways.
Yeah.
One thing which I keep on hearing from leaders is that people still sort of hate performance management, if I'm putting it nicely. Why do you think that is?
I actually love this question as well. And I do think, to put it bluntly, a lot of people do hate it. That might be kind for some people even. Um, I think it's for a variety of different reasons, really. I think, first of all, it's not necessarily a frequent source of feedback. So, a lot of companies focus on annual or semi-annual reviews. So that's not really focusing on timely feedback. So if you want to create a culture of ongoing real-time feedback, performance management, the way it's set up today, doesn't really allow for that. I think the other reason a lot of people hate it is because the way it's laid out at a lot of companies is it's very time consuming for both managers and employees. They find the process very tedious and intensive. And so it's not laid out, and it kind of just feels like a check the box activity versus something that people should actually relish or enjoy. I don't know if anyone will ever truly relish or enjoy it, but if we wanted to kind of get to that sort of utopia as well. Another thing I would say is lack of clarity. Depending on your manager and who you work with, those KPIs or those OKRs and those expectations may not be clearly defined, or communicated, which can at the end create a level of bias, right, or unfairness when it comes to coming up with performance ratings as well.
Yeah.
I also think that it sometimes takes a one size fits all approach, right? As you and I
Yeah.
both know, there's so many different types of functions and departments and roles that exist in an organization. And
Hmm.
it feels like a lot of the time we're butting heads with managers because they're like, this isn't going to work for our function, right? It just, we need it to be customized. So I think for some people, the one size fits all doesn't really work. And I think the other one that really stands out for me in particular, and I mean, I think there's many, many more, is just the disconnection rewards. Because a lot of time you're talking about performance and
Mm.
rewards, right? But
Yeah.
performance ratings don't always or may not always align with compensation or career advancement. So those are the ones that really kind of stick out in my mind when I think about it. And just frankly, overall, the level of stress and anxiety it creates for people as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll break down your answer into three or four parts because each of these things we keep on hearing from, the leaders that we speak with or companies that we speak to. The first one, and I'm going a little bit of out of syllabus over here. The first one, which you mentioned, that it feels almost like an overhead to people. It feels like a chore or an overhead. Is that truly, can we truly get around that? Have you found anybody who feels that, especially managers who feel that, no, this is a part of my role and responsibility, and not like, oh, should I do this? Should I do my actual work or should I fill up this thing which HR is saying? Can we get around that ever?
It's a good question. I think the real answer there is it depends, right? And the reason I say that is first and foremost, not all people that are managers should be managers, if I'm being completely honest.
Oh, yeah.
Nor do they really do it for the right reasons. I think in the past, historically, people felt that in order to move up in an organization, they need to become people leaders, right? unless
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
unless there are opportunities to be frankly well paid senior individual contributors. And so some
Yeah.
people are becoming managers for the wrong reasons, in which case that has a downstream impact and effect, because what's going to happen is that they don't necessarily care about, I'm going to say, the well-being and the thought process behind how to develop their people. They're just thinking about
Mm,
their own self-interest. So
yeah.
that's why I say it depends. I think for the people that take their jobs as managers and frankly as leaders more so, they see themselves more as leaders seriously, and they take more of that servant leader aspect. They constantly want to find a way to do better, to offer more feedback, to do it on a regular basis. So I think it's almost bifurcating good leadership from poor leadership and who should be a manager and who shouldn't. Because then, and kind of continuing kind of like to what Klaar is doing and to the conversation we're having, what are some of the things we can do
Yeah.
to make it feel like something we'd want to engage in, right? And I think there are certain companies out there who, you know, we know or we've read about that really don't use performance ratings or things of that nature, and they focus on feedback.
Yeah.
And some that don't and won't get there. So, but I do think we need to look at the entire ecosystem to see if some of that can change.
Got it. That is such an important point, especially now when I look back in my own experience when I
Mm-hmm.
was in HR, the best of the leaders sort of didn't have that attitude that this is an overhead. They were always like, I should proactively give feedback and develop my team. That's
Yep.
something which I always noticed. And the second part of, what you mentioned is there's no going around the fact that it is indeed probably time consuming, especially if
Mm-hmm.
I have, let's say, 8 direct reports and I
Yep.
have to fill up for my peers. I'm probably doing like 15 performance reviews. And it's a stressful process because at the end of the day, even if we want to link rewards or not, probably the salary, the compensation, it has a downstream impact. Why do you think that, or how do we get around that stress? Or is it something which is inherently a part of the process? Do you think breaking it up into sort of continuous conversations might help, circumvent that stress? Or is it a given that, okay, these 2 months will be stressful?
I think it's I think it's a couple of things. First of all, you need to make sure that whatever org design, to your point, you're kind of alluding to, like your org design is correct. So because there is a point where, especially if you're actually a producer as well as a manager, that you have too many direct reports, right? And um, there's
Yeah,
different views on what that looks like, right? And that's very much a conversation about what your span of control looks like, right?
yeah.
And if it has got too big, even if you're the best manager, you're gonna become ineffective, right? Because you
Mm,
don't have the capacity to support the people the way you would. So you need to make sure you're putting in place a structure where everyone feels heard, everyone's getting feedback, there is consistency. So I think org design actually plays a big part into that conversation as well. So I don't think it necessarily has to be as fraught as it needs to be if that is actually um, done
thoughtfully.
well. And yeah, it's
Mm,
thoughtful. And so I also think you need to be able to adopt a growth mindset on this, right? And a focus on individual improvement rather than just comparative performance, I think is another important thing. And implementing continuous feedback, because if it's happening all the time, it doesn't feel unusual. Now, it takes
yes.
time to get into that stage, but once you're there, then it just becomes part of the norm and part of the culture and fabric of an organization. And also, focusing on team performance can be something that still don't think we look at enough, right?
Yeah,
Versus just individual performance, right? I do think, though, human nature is one where we tend to compare, right? And so that's always going to be one of the things that's going to be hard to do or get away from, right? And I think even if you think about, I'm used to have done a lot of calibration sessions in my career, and
mm,
it always ends up being in a situation where you're comparing person X
yeah,
to person Y, right? I also think there's sometimes limited sort of resources for rewards and promotions, which also makes
yeah.
this conversation a lot more tricky. So, but I think having some of these things that I just mentioned in place means it doesn't need to be as frenetic as I think it's
Yeah.
been in the past. And also the planning that's put in place. I mean, I have found, once I have kind of sort of reimagined performance management at different companies, if you have a specific plan, if you have a timeline, if you work towards that, if you have
Mm,
things like FAQs, if you communicate transparently on it doesn't, I'm not saying it's going to be great, because I still
yeah.
think there's an evolution here, but it's going to be way better than it was previously. And I talk a lot about going from the 1.0 to the 2.0 to the 3.0, and that's what it needs to be, building blocks.
Awesome. Awesome. I think that's really helpful. And you touched upon so many things which I'll just get to in a second. I'll probably backtrack a little bit, and especially startups. When I speak to startups, let's say they are a 50 people, 100 people, or 150 people startup. And one of the questions which HR leads sort of pose to me is that, Sharthok, how do we convince our founders that performance management is really adding value? And how
Mm-hmm.
do we start the process? Because some of the founders, they're like, what is there to performance management? You have goals in an Excel sheet. Just go ahead and rate people on those goals and be done with it. So
Mm-hmm.
my question is, have you ever faced have you ever faced a scenario where there has been no performance management? Or what would
Mm-hmm.
happen if a company just stops doing performance management? Like, what's the impact? Why do we do it in the first place?
It's a great question. I think that, first of all, I've seen both. Like I have seen if it where it hasn't even existed, and sort of where that can be, prove challenging and whatnot, and also where, frankly, people have kind of just been going through the motions.
Hmm.
So I would say first and foremost, I think that where it doesn't exist, it means that there's a lack of formal feedback. First of all, that's happening, right?
Yeah.
People might be unclear and uncertain about their performance if they don't have any clear OKRs or KPIs. How are you really measuring success? Um,
Hmm.
and then there's really reduced conversation that you can have, or opportunities around structured career development conversations, right? Because how can you address that if you're not talking about people's performance, or you don't have any sort of system or infrastructure in place, right?
Yeah.
I think the other thing it breeds is compensation challenges. And I think going back to your point about founders wake up when they start seeing retention issues, especially for who they consider their top talent. So if they're
Yeah.
starting to lose people and it ties to, and they're saying it's because of compensation or reward, then they start waking up to that, right? So data
Hmm.
still plays a big part in this, right? So I think if you're seeing increased attrition data for top talent, if you're seeing survey data saying that people are unhappy about or have a lack of clarity around their
Yeah.
jobs, around what success looks like, I think these are things that are going to start resonating with people. But just telling
Hmm.
people to do it for the sake of doing it is not going to move the needle, is not going to influence founder mentality, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's things like that. They need to actually see the impact
Hmm.
on the culture, I feel like, in order to take it seriously, right? Because there's other things like legal and compliance risks and, reduced
Yeah.
accountability, things we all know about, but it's going to be them actually seeing how it's hurting their culture.
Yeah. I think that's such an important point, and especially folks, if you are in this boat where, you're sort of trying to convince founders, I think that's one of the biggest points that especially probably articulating well that how will this make an impact which resonates with the founders, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, it can be the retention issues or the impact on culture, because some things are pretty straightforward. Like if I don't do talent acquisition, I'm not getting the people in place, and my
Mm-hmm.
business will immediately stutter. But this one is probably a little more nuanced, because of which it takes that time.
Yep.
And one more thing you mentioned, that in which I've always found, even if the process is just about feedback, I found that the moment it goes into calibrations is when
Yes.
the comparison sort of starts. And that question, now, what I'm alluding to is, you would have designed rather, multiple performance management processes. You would have seen
Mm-hmm.
and experienced. Can you play favorites among them, or have you seen any process to work better than the others? What does it really depend on? Does it depend on the
Um,
size?
it's yeah, it goes back to that. It's not one size fits one. I find that people that try and architect or bring the same performance management philosophy from one company to another tend to fail, right? Because you're not
Mm,
taking into account the maturity of your client, where their head is at, what they've done with performance in the past. I think for me, it's always been, when I've joined an organization, when I've thought about performance, it's kind of going back to what I said, is really understanding a few things, like, making sure that whatever you develop aligns with their organizational goals, right? Because everything trickles down from there, right?
yeah, yeah.
Understanding what type of frequency of feedback they've given and how that may or may not need to change in the future.
Mm,
Metrics and KPIs, do you have them? Are they real? Are their version of metrics and KPIs what we would actually consider real metrics and KPIs? Because I've seen a lot where people think they're writing smart goals and they're not smart at all, right?
yeah.
Is there an employee development focus? Because a lot of times it's kind of like people aren't necessarily thinking about the development focus. They're just purely thinking about their actual on the job performance, which is obviously
Performance. Yeah.
critical. But there's going to be, everyone has gaps. We all do. None of us is perfect. So, how are we closing the gaps and helping people develop as well for their own careers?
Yeah.
I'm a big, probably not surprised, that's why we're working together. I'm a big, like, people tech stack person. So also thinking
Yeah.
about how, especially from a system standpoint, how does that integrate with your other HR systems? Does it create a seamless sort of environment or employee experience for people, especially if you're at a remote first company, which where systems play such a huge role
Absolutely.
in your day to day now, right, and how you interact with other employees. And then I just think the other one that's really big is culture, is fairness and transparency, right?
Mm,
Like,
yeah.
how fair and transparent is the process? Like, have you told people and kept them informed of how it works from start to finish, right?
Yeah.
And then the last one probably would be, um, user friendliness. It goes back and efficiency. It goes back to what we were talking about. Like, how can we make it less tedious, right?
Yeah.
Whenever I go in, though, I try to understand what has been done before. You need the context of what has been done in before so you can understand how to improve it in the future. And I think sometimes the biggest mistake I've seen is people just immediately break apart or rip apart what
Yes.
was done previously and don't actually find out if there was any good in any of it that they could carry forward.
Oh my gosh, this resonates so much because in my career, for some reason or the other, there have been new chief people officers coming in when I just joined the company. And the first step has been reinventing the entire wheel. Just break
Yeah.
apart everything and that's detrimental. I mean, people are like,
Yep.
HR changes every 3 years. What the hell? So, but I'll allude to another stray question. And while you were saying this, it immediately struck me. A lot of the times when I used to go to functional leaders, let's say of departments which cannot necessarily be quantified very easily. For example, product, project management, right? Sales, revenue can be quantified easily. But these departments, sometimes I found that they have a little bit of resistance that why is HR now talking to us about setting goals? I mean, you can't set smart goals and all of those things. Is that just me, or have you also faced that in your performance experience?
Do you mean as in why, in the sense that why is HR not being more proactive about approaching departments about
No,
these things?
the opposite. That why is HR now coming and asking us to set goals? And
Interesting, yeah. Yeah. I think so. I think I have come across that. I do think, I think this is always the thing where I'd say like HR becomes like a dumping ground for everything, right?
yeah,
And I think sometimes this is where, again, like performance isn't owned by HR, right? It's owned by
yes,
everyone. And
yes,
I think that's where I've always struggled with that. It's because where I find is that normally means there's a communication disconnect on the leadership team.
mm,
And there might be somebody, frankly, on the C suite who is not funneling down the right
yeah,
information to their teams.
yeah,
And so, again, this goes back to the point I was making. This is where the consistency around the process and transparency of information, right? And I'll be honest, in my career, that's why sometimes I've done these sort of catch-all kind of communications about processes because I've not always been able to rely on certain C-suite leaders to get the word
absolutely,
out to their people.
yeah,
But
yeah,
I've also, by design, because I didn't want a performance management cycle to fail, I did that. But I was also,
mm,
by nature, enabling the problem when I did that. So I've learned over time to really reinforce to the C-suite, like, if this doesn't work, it's not just on me, it's on all of you, right?
yeah,
And I still think some people aren't necessarily comfortable having that conversation as HR leaders, and others are. And sometimes the appetite on the receiving end isn't necessarily there.
yeah, yeah. I think it's the hallmark of a good HR leader, like you mentioned, that you might have been enabling that problem, and I have done the same thing where one C-suite leader is not probably funneling it down. Let me go and talk
Yep.
to their people so that the performance cycle doesn't fail.
Yep.
So probably it's more about first getting the buy-in, influencing people that, hey, this is something which is required, and then going ahead with it, where I found that it mostly works.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think just fact of life is and nature is we all know that certain leaders are better at communicating and trickling down
yeah,
information than others. And so that's always that one's going to be a hard one to fix. You just have to over communicate as much as possible what the expectations of them are, I think, as
yeah,
well. And hold them accountable if they don't take those actions as well.
yeah. And I think that's where the founder support also comes into the picture, right? Founder or CEO support, because
Mm-hmm.
like you said, it's owned by the business, it's owned by everybody, right? And not just
Yep.
HR. Um, yeah. And this is like genuinely interesting. And I'll go back to a couple of things you mentioned that the linkage with rewards, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of places, I find that people go, oh, another performance review is happening, which means that we will get a salary increase or
Yep.
our compensation will increase, right?
Yep.
And is that is that a wrong way of looking at it? I mean, is it okay if people sort of link performance with rewards? Have you seen the focus then move to just looking at the rankings and not at the feedback?
Yeah, it's a great question. What I like to call the decoupling question.
Yeah,
Um, it's, I will tell you my personal point of view, and I've gone back and forth with leaders on this over the years, as you can imagine. I think personally, I like to decouple the
hmm.
conversation. The reason I say that is, especially in bigger companies where I've at, where you've had probably you may be handing out a compensation statement at the end of your feedback discussion, right? Really, if
Yeah,
people know that, all they're waiting is for that piece of paper, and they glaze
yes,
over the feedback, right?
yes,
So I am a big firm believer of separating them out, even if it's a week apart, just so that they're separate discussions, right?
yeah,
And so it's not like a race to find out what was my performance rating and what kind of increase or bonus am I getting. So I tend to be more in that camp. It also allows for more honest feedback and that focuses on development.
hmm.
And it also, I think, reduces some of the stress and the competition that comes with it. Um, I think for some people, though, who don't like decoupling it, it's because they feel like it may reduce, at least some of the things I've heard from leaders in the past, it may reduce motivation for high performance. But again, if you're doing it a week apart, I don't necessarily see that to be the case.
Yeah,
Um, but the other thing is, I think for most people, it's just been also an efficiency play. If I'm being
yes,
completely honest, people are like, one conversation, that's just like wrap it up in a bow.
yeah.
Like I don't have time to do two separate conversations. So it's kind of less about the individual and more about their own capacity, which I think is not the right way to look at it.
Gotcha. That's just the crux I feel, where just have one conversation, be done with it, and you can justify it any way which you want. And
Yeah.
a sort of related question and I get to hear this so often, gosh, can we ever truly get out of the bell curve? Do we need to get out of the bell curve in the first place?
It's interesting because I feel like the people use the bell curve sometimes not necessarily for the good as we know, but more for the bad, right? Like
Yeah,
how can we establish who are the bottom 10% in case we need to, lay
absolutely.
people off, right? Or fire
Yeah.
people and the business is headed in the wrong direction. So I don't necessarily like the bell curve because of things like that. And I have seen that
Hmm.
happen in my career. On the flip side, where I think the curve, and it doesn't need to be a forced curve, it could even be more of a suggested curve. Where I have seen it be more useful is if you're a company where you rate highly all the time. You don't know how to
Hmm.
differentiate performance, right? So I've worked at organizations where I'm like, okay, not everyone, five was the highest and one was the lowest, right? And I was like, oh my God, how are the bulk of people fours, right?
Yeah.
And I think it goes
Yeah.
back to people don't want to be the bad cop. They don't want to give tough feedback. They don't want to
Hmm.
be the one delivering that. And they also don't want to be an outlier if everyone else is giving fours as well. So I
Yeah.
do think that if you are, it goes back to what we were saying, why it can't be not one size fits all. If you are a company that operates like that, first of all, how are you going to pay your people if they're all highly ranked like that? Because that has an
Yes.
impact on reward. But then
Yeah.
on top of it, you're not differentiating performance as well. So I think
Hmm.
there's different sides to the coin of this answer, right?
Hmm.
But I do think that it can work well if used in the right situations or the right companies at the right time. And I think it
Hmm.
could be detrimental in other situations.
Got it. Again, I think like most answers in HR is that it depends. Exactly.
It does. It does.
It,
We live in the gray. I always say like
yeah.
you can't work in HR if you need things to be very black and white because we live in
Yeah.
the gray. Ambiguity is our best friend. I
Oh,
don't
I'm
know
stealing
that.
that.
Yeah. So, and you've got to be comfortable with it, right?
Yeah,
Because there is not necessarily a right or wrong as much there is what is the best case, what is the best decision for that particular problem you're trying to solve.
I think I think this also, and you mentioned such an important point, which is people don't like to be the bad cop. I mean, I think that's just human nature. What I used to tell managers, and I think this also builds the case for continuous performance management or conversational performance management, whichever way you put it, is that at the end of the year, so managers used to come back and tell me that, Sharthok, I worked with this person for 12 months. How can I just go and tell my direct report that, no, you're not doing well and you're not going to receive a salary increment? And I'm
Yeah.
like, why didn't you tell that person for the 12 months? What were you doing for the 12 months? Because it's not a sudden thing which is happening. I think that also builds the case for continuous feedback, that
Mm-hmm.
if you're giving this sort of feedback, the person is also mentally prepared that, okay, probably, I'm not going to get a good rating or ranking this year around. Have you seen continuous feedback help that way as well to convey the sort of bad news?
I think it can. It can and it has. It also depends very much on that person's mindset and
Hmm.
whether they are they have EQ and right they have the emotional intelligence to be open to what their blind spots are, and the feedback, because I think we also know that there are people out there who you can give the same feedback to over and over again and they'll still not see it or not take it on
Yeah,
board, right?
yeah.
And so or become defensive about it. So but there's other people, if you continue to do that, or if they're hearing it from more than one person, which again, we haven't really talked about 360s, but sometimes
Mm,
360s can also help kind of wake people up and say, because sometimes people think that it's just the manager picking on them and making
yes,
these points.
yes.
But if they
Yeah,
start hearing more voices say the same things, that can be more of an awakening for people as well. So I think that is a big piece of the pie as well.
gotcha. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that is just so important. And people ask me that, why 360? I think that's one of the best answers I've heard. 360 is just more holistic, right? Obviously, it takes a
Yeah.
little more time and probably effort, but yeah. Okay, Alex, last question. I know we are at the end of our session, but last question.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of talk about AI in performance management, AI in HR. We are hearing about AI employees. How do you see AI actually making an impact in performance management, talent management? Is it too early, or are there genuine use cases it can actually address?
I think it has the propensity to be play a very significant role. I think not just in performance management, I also think in overall talent management.
Yeah,
I think there's a couple, and like anything, there needs to be guardrails on things, right? As we know. But some of the things I think about when I think about AI in this space is, frankly, data, right? Data analysis and insights, right?
yeah,
Could it help us sort of analyze large volumes of performance data to look at and identify different patterns and trends, right? Is there
yes,
the possibility of, providing predictive analytics on performance and potential, right? So, I definitely think the data analysis and insights is something that will be huge with AI. I definitely think, we were just talking about continuous feedback. I think it could
yeah,
play a tool in that, because I think a lot of the AI tools that are, people are starting to think about or building or have can facilitate real-time feedback and prompting managers and employees at the appropriate times, especially sort
yeah,
of those managers that we know are not good, right, at doing that on a
yeah,
on a real-time basis, and also those employees who are maybe scared of giving feedback as well.
yeah.
And then I also think for things like personalized development plans, right, which I still think
Mm,
not nearly enough of people or managers do for their folks, and probably because it's the time and investment that goes into it, is
absolutely.
like
Yeah,
you could probably tailor learning and development opportunities based on somebody's performance, their skills, their career goals, whatever it may be. um, and then the other one that sort of just springs to mind is also bias reduction. Can it actually help
Mm,
reduce some of the unconscious biases that come out of performance evaluations as well? So those are the things that come up top of mind, and why I do think, again, with the appropriate guardrails, they would be it's going to be massively helpful.
gotcha. I think, I mean, that's just four very, very needed real world applications and exciting days ahead for HR tech actually implementing it and not just, being a frill or a gimmick.
Yeah.
Awesome. Alex, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. This was like amazing. Expected nothing less. And I hope people who watch this, you find the value in this episode, and we'll see you very soon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.